we're still waiting for a few other people, but I'm gonna just kick things off. And first and foremost, to introduce myself, my name is Helen Prosser, and I'm one of the founders of Brilliant Beginnings and NGA Law. And I'm just so thrilled to be talking to you from London. We've got a lovely international crew here today. Just because we're going to be recording this, it is the 14th of December, 2021. We're 10 days away from Christmas, hence you can see lovely Christmas trees in some of our backgrounds. I'm really, really pleased to be here today. It just feels like it's been a long time coming. This is the second in a series that we wanted to put on before Christmas, just because we're aware that a lot of people are going to be thinking about surrogacy and families in the new year, and we wanted to just give a little bit more information to give some up-to-date information on what's happening in the US. First and foremost, a little bit of housekeeping. If you're joining us, I can see everybody has got their microphones off. We are going to be recording this, and we'll circulate a copy of this afterwards. So if you do miss anything and you want to re-listen to it, then that will be available to you. And we do have a little chat box, which you'll see at the bottom center of your screen. And by all means, just pop any questions you have along the way, and I'll make sure that we pick those up. If not during the talks themselves, then we'll certainly pick them up afterwards. And similarly, we'll be very happy to answer questions offline by email, and we'll make sure that everybody has details of who to contact and how to contact them afterwards. I'm excited to introduce you to our wonderful team of speakers tonight. Brilliant Beginnings was founded just over 8 years ago, and we certainly never expected to have the couple of years that we've had for the last, 20 months or so. You know, one of the things that you know, Natalie and I, when we set up Brilliant Beginnings, were thinking about was really we wanted to enable, you know, an easier route to parenthood for those people who were thinking about surrogacy. And I can honestly say that we never anticipated COVID to throw things in our way to, you know, navigate through yet another set of parameters and hurdles and obstacles. But here we are, and I'm grateful to say that we're now through some of that, and we do have a path through. So we can now begin to be thinking about surrogacy in the US. And the other foundation that we wanted to make sure happened when we were establishing Brilliant Beginnings and our US pathway was really to enable people to access really the most professional other organizations in the US, so that people both here in the UK and in the US would have that seamless support all the way through their journey. And so this is why I'm particularly excited to introduce you to the team that we have today, talking to you today about surrogacy in the US and choosing your egg donor and some of the things that you're going to be needing to think about. So first off, we're going to hear from Laura. Laura is a pretty phenomenal lady. Not only is she a UK surrogate, she is also one of our client managers, and she is also a nurse, and she is also a mum of 2, and I don't know when she sleeps. But Laura is going to give us just an overview. Laura's role at Brilliant Beginnings is in part looking after some of the teams that go to the US. So she really has a very good grasp of that whole pathway and the whole picture. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Jeff Wang, who is going to talk to us about the clinical process and how to choose an egg donor. And he joins us as medical director from the American Fertility Services in Connecticut. And then we'll move on to the legal aspect, and my long-standing friend Natalie is going to talk to us about all things legal in the US and the UK. And then last but not least, really the pièce de résistance that I was just saying is Julie Villieu, who is a US surrogate. Not only is she a US surrogate, she is a 4-time US surrogate. So if I'm honest, there isn't really very much that I could ever add to Julie's journey, and she's going to talk to us about her perspective and things to think about as a US surrogate. So I'm going to start off by introducing you properly to Laura. So as I said, Laura is a client manager with Brilliant Beginnings and works with so many of our teams who start their journey in surrogacy, as well as offering that experience with her nursing background and her surrogate hat on. So over to you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Very kind of you. So I'm extremely privileged to be in the position now to support others through their journey in the UK and internationally, given my background of being a surrogate 3 times myself. So in terms of intended parents coming to us that are thinking about surrogacy in the US, we often see that they come to us looking for information and support, and just a way to kind of start their journey and get that going. What we often hear is it's quite tough sometimes to kind of get that quality and accurate information online. It's quite tough to kind of bring it all together, and it's quite overwhelming. So for many intended parents, looking into the right options for their unique situation is quite key before making any real important decisions on moving forward. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about how we support you at Brilliant Beginnings with our US pathway for Brilliant Beginnings and NGA, and why it's so popular for lots of people here in the UK. So why the US then? So loads of positives in the US is that it's well established. They've been doing surrogacy for many, many years now. It's very well established, ethically minded. The surrogates are screened and prepared extremely well. Donor availability in terms of egg donation is big. There's plenty of choice, and Jeff will kind of talk to you about that a little bit later too. Time-wise, generally the wait times for surrogates is a lot shorter than it is in the UK, and the legal safeguards that come with having kind of the US pathway, given that it is kind of the contracts in the US are legally binding. So as we all know, coronavirus has hit us quite hard over the last 18 months, but actually surrogacy in the US is still possible, and it has still been happening. The availability to travel for birth has always been there, and Natalie and her team have done some amazing things over the last 18 months to help parents get across to be there for the birth of their babies. There is also the option of exporting gametes from the UK to the US. So actually getting on a plane and traveling there isn't necessarily needed at this early point in the process when you're just starting out. So if you get to the point where you've decided that the US is the route for you, the next step is to kind of pull those choices together for you. So there are hundreds of organisations in the US that you could choose from. So finding the right ones could prove quite difficult. And I guess that's where we step in terms of Brilliant Beginnings and kind of setting setting out who are the right people and the most ethical people to go to. So each set of intended parents will have very different circumstances that they're coming to us with. They may want different things from their journey in terms of, you know, timing, location, the communication that they want with the partners that they work with, things like, do they need an egg donor or not? And also budget, you know, so budget's a real key point to kind of start off with as soon as you begin your journey. So in terms of how we would help that, we would identify those partners for you. So that would be an agency that would support you in matching you with a surrogate, a clinic who would take your egg donor and surrogate through their treatment, and an attorney that will draw up your contracts with your egg donor and your surrogate for each of those parts. The first thing, and probably the most key thing to do, is to get you signed up with an agency, because actually the wait time in the US for that surrogate match, you really need to kind of get that clock ticking as soon as possible. So that would be our first port of call, really. Get you signed up with that agency, get that clock ticking, and then we can kind of get on with all the other things in the background. So in terms of wait times for matching with surrogates at the moment in the US, we are seeing around about the 6 to 9 month mark. Pre-COVID, it was a little bit shorter. We were looking at potentially 3 to 6 months, but with things as they are at the moment, you know, agencies are quoting 6 to 9, and actually they're really good at keeping to that figure. So, you know, if they say to you 9 months is our wait time to be matched with a surrogate, then they will absolutely achieve that for you. So in terms of some planning, future planning, that's quite good for lots of people. So whilst you're waiting with your agency to be matched with an amazing surrogate in the US, you will kind of be working in the background to either create embryos with the US clinic, or potentially move them or get them shipped if they're already created here in the UK. And Dr. Wang will talk more about that a little bit later. The attorney in the US will draw those contracts, but also you will have your legal support here in the UK from NGA Law, who will look through all those relevant contracts and make sure that they're all tip-top in line with UK law too. So the next bit is kind of being matched with your surrogate. You will then kind of go through all that screening with your surrogate, and then you're looking at kind of getting to the treatment part. We obviously would all love for treatment to just happen and it to work first time for everyone. But I think realistically, what we plan and what we tell people is that if you plan for 2 to 3 transfers, if it happens before that, then that's a real bonus. But you know, it isn't a given, and it's hard to manage everybody's expectations. But hopefully, if you kind of plan and factor in for those 2 to 3 transfers, then you shouldn't be disappointed at all. So you're in an amazing position that your surrogate is now pregnant, and you have to kind of plan for getting baby home. So at that point, NGA will kick in with their legal support, and we kind of work with them quite closely and keep them updated of any progress during the pregnancy. They will kind of step in from around 20 weeks to help you with that kind of legal support and making sure everything's in shape for kind of traveling home with baby. And your attorney on the US side will also kind of help you with the pre or post birth orders, depending on what state your surrogate's based in. So in terms of when your baby's born in the US. There's likely to be a short stay there post-birth. And that's in order just to kind of get generally your US passport in place in order to travel home on with the baby. There would be an option to kind of travel home on a UK passport if your surrogate was single. However, that would be a longer stay in the US if you chose that route. Generally, people want to get home much quicker than that, but that it really is down to a personal choice. So I think one of the big things that we talk about with lots of our intended parents is budget. So I just wanted to kind of break that down a little bit first for everybody, because that's kind of obviously the pressing thing for everybody when they're making a choice and decisions about things. So we always say in our options review meetings that a healthy budget, a healthy starting budget for a US surrogacy journey for UK international intended parents would be anywhere between a baseline of £150,000 to £160,000. And that is broken down into things like agency fees. You will have your agency fees along with your surrogate and egg donor compensation. If you're using an egg donor through a clinic, you will have her compensation through that. But if you choose an egg donor through an agency, you will also have an agency fee on top of that too. There will be clinic costs, so the physical clinical costs of treating your egg donor, creating your embryos, and treating your surrogate as well in order to help her get pregnant. You will then have your US legal costs to draw up your contracts, and your UK legal costs to help you rectify your UK legal parentage here at home. And because it's an international journey, that is generally seen within the High Court. You have insurances, which is obviously a massive thing in the US, and actually a really important part. You know, we're lucky to have the NHS here, but you need to be really prepared in terms of insurances when you go to the US. So you'll need to cover insurance for your surrogate and also your newborn when they arrive. And then on top of that, you've got potential travel and accommodation for you guys a couple of times during the pregnancy, and when you arrive out there for baby's birth, and however many weeks you need to stay until you can get home again. So in terms of RBB and NGA US pathway, you know, we like to take away the uncertainty of you making your first steps. We support you with those initial choices, but also throughout that journey, practically and legally, and make sure you're set up with the right people that are there to do things the way you would like to do things. The agencies we work with are reputable, well-established, and have really good international experience. The organisations we work with also work well together, so we tailor everybody's choices to what it is that they want from their journey, and make sure that everybody that we kind of put forward also works well together. We don't receive any kind of commission or kickback from the agencies that we work with. We feel that it's about getting the right fit for you, and whatever your unique circumstances brings, then that's what we'll try to achieve. So yeah, I guess from us on a BB perspective, it's really great to be able to see people through from right at the beginning where they're making those choices, right to the end, and supporting them through that, bringing their baby home. So as a team, that's why we do what we do, and it's really lovely to be a part of that, however kind of small or big that is.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. That was really, really helpful.
Thanks, Helen.
For anybody that's got any questions around any of that, just a little reminder to pop it in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we accommodate time at the end to pick anything up. I know that was a really 10-minute whistle stop of something that is, you know, a long pathway, but hopefully it gives you the headlines for things to think about. Okay, so let's move on to Dr. Jeff Wang, who is medical director, as I said, of the American Fertility Services. And we've had the real pleasure of working with Dr. Wang for a number of years. And I think, you know, it is very safe to say that one of the things or the key takeaways over and above, you know, his experience and, you know, his ability in helping people to not just achieve embryos, but to achieve pregnancies and babies is his really personalized care. It's always been, he's always hands-on, he's always, you know, incredibly responsive and incredibly helpful. So I think you'll find that with him today. And again, loads of questions in the chat box if that's what if we aren't able to answer the questions in the talk. But Dr. Wang completed his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at New York Presbyterian Columbia University, where he's also held fellowship in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. But as I said, first and foremost, you know, he's just the most wonderful man to be able to work alongside. And we've had the privilege of had many successful journeys along the way with Dr. Wang. So Dr. Wang, over to you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Appreciate the lovely, wonderful introduction. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Truly is a privilege for us to be a part of the team. You know, I think generally speaking, third party building a family through egg donation surrogacy is a truthfully complicated process that has many different parts, and you have to interact with a lot of people, and certainly when you add on an international component, it adds a little bit more complexity on top of something that's already, you know, an intricate process. So being able to partner with a team like Brilliant Beginnings, where everyone has the same goal that we have, is truly a special synergy, you know. And like Brilliant Beginnings, we want to empower our patients with the knowledge to make the best decision for their own families, because as Laura mentioned, everyone's experience is different. We have different background, we have different things that we're looking for, you know, different limitations. So I think it is best to have the knowledge so that we can collaboratively with you make you know, the decision that's best for your family. Now, not everyone needs egg donation to build a family, but in some cases, we do need to have the assistance of an egg donor to build a family. So I want to spend a little time to talk about the selection process as well as the screening process. You know, after the talk, if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. In terms of selecting an egg donor, traditionally there are two paths. One is to work with an egg donation agency, similar to surrogacy agencies in the US. There are many agencies that help to recruit egg donors throughout the United States. And the other possibility is also just to work with clinics, egg donation programs. Many clinics, such as ourselves, we also recruit donors you know, as part of our program. So there are pros and cons with each approach. With agency egg donation, they tend to recruit donors throughout the US. And so their applicant pools are usually in the hundreds. Whereas clinics, generally, we recruit donors are within driving distance to our clinics. So we have a much more tighter geographic limitation, if you will. But of course, for different intended parents that have different needs, I would say for intended parents who have a lot of selection criteria, often working with agency might be a better fit for them because they have more choices. However, agencies often have an added layer of agency cost, travel reimbursement costs if your donors come from another state. Agency donors tend to not have a limit to their requested compensation. So I think overall the cost element will be a bigger burden for the intended parents. With clinic egg donors, I think it's the exact reverse. We get to help our intended parents save a lot of the costs because there's no agency fee. We cap the donor compensation to $10,000 US because donors can drive, excuse me, to the clinic. You can avoid a lot of the additional costs. So I think, with every intended parents, we can help guide you in terms of making, help you make a decision that is best for you. As far as the screening process, once you have selected your donor, regardless of whether the donor comes from an agency or from our clinical program, the screening process will be exactly the same. In your search for the ideal donor, there are some characteristics that we would recommend that you pay attention to. And I think age is usually the biggest factor, and our usual recommendation is to find a donor between the ages of 21 to 31. Biologically, as we get older, everything ages, including the ovaries. So with time, the number of eggs that we have will decrease. The quality of the eggs will also decline. And so at a certain point in time, it does make it harder to find the right embryo to help intended parents to build their family. So, generally speaking, 21 to 31 is our recommendation. Of course, just because an egg donor is between the ages of 21 to 31 doesn't guarantee that she has good egg reserve. So we will help you do further testing to make sure that the quantity of the eggs is within the expected range. Aside from this, of course, we want the egg donor to be physically healthy, mentally healthy. She should have a good family history, free of genetic conditions, inheritable medical conditions. She shouldn't use drugs or smoke, and should also have good motivation for wanting to help others build a family. In terms of the screening process, first step, we will take a detailed history and perform a thorough physical exam for the egg donor. The ovarian reserve testing that we mentioned earlier involves two tests. The first one is a blood test called AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone. The follicles in the ovaries will release this hormone. And so, of course, the more follicles or more eggs we have, the higher the AMH level. We also do a sonogram to look at the actual follicles where the eggs are, and we do what's called a follicle count. And so between these two pieces of information, we're able to tell our intended parents what we expect to retrieve in an egg donation cycle from any particular donor. Okay. Besides ovarian reserve testing, of course, we're required by the FDA to do a very detailed, thorough infectious disease testing. We will also do a drug screen, as we mentioned. From a genetic point of view in the US, most of us will do a complete genetic screening panel looking for 200 to 300 different common genetic conditions. And this is important because we also need to match this information with that of the intended father and make sure that the donor and the intended father do not share any common mutations such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell. So genetic screening is also an important part of the selection screening process. Lastly, the donor will go through, a psychological evaluation by a trained professional. The intent of this, of course, is to make sure that we identify, any potential psychological conditions in the donor or in the family history that might be relevant for the egg donation process. And once an egg donor completes these 5 components of the screening and passes everything, then the attorneys will assist the intended parents and the egg donor to draft a legal agreement. And once we have the legal agreement, then we can proceed with the actual egg donation treatment. A couple questions that often will come up from the intended parents. They often ask, is it important to pick a proven donor, or is it okay to work with a first-time donor? Of course, we all have to start somewhere. So, first-time donors generally are fine to work with. There are some advantages to working with a proven donor. For example, donors who have gone through egg donation treatment have already had ovarian reserve testing from prior cycles. So you already know before a match, their AMH level, their follicle count, genetic testing results will be available. Psychological evaluation results from prior donation will also be available. So all this information will be there for you to review before you actually commit to a match. And I think this can be quite helpful. In addition to that, we also can obtain prior donation records. For example, we can find out how many eggs were actually retrieved from a donor and how many embryos came from that donation. And this reflects more of the egg quality, which for first-time donor, we would not be able to provide that information. Okay, so I think generally speaking, if I had a choice, everything being equal, I probably would lean towards working with an experienced donor. But of course, there are also advantages to working with first-time donor. Probably, I would estimate 60 to maybe 80% of donors are first-time donors. So if you were to open your selection to first-time donors, you would have a lot more donors that you can consider, and this can also speed up the match time. And also, first-time donors generally have a lower requested compensation. Okay, so there are some advantages to working with first-time donor, and this is a very individualized decision, which again, we will help each individual set of intended parents to make the best decision. Another common question that comes up is whether we should consider using frozen eggs. Since the beginning of egg donation, the standard approach has been to work with the egg donor through a fresh IVF cycle where she goes through the screening process, then she takes the IVF medication, just like a traditional IVF treatment. The eggs are retrieved and fertilized with the intended father's sperm, and then the embryos are generated. With improvement in the egg freezing technology, a lot of egg banks are now going ahead with the stimulation and retrieval of the egg donor even before they're matched with any intended parents. The eggs are then frozen at the unfertilized state. So when intended fathers take their donor from an egg bank, the eggs can be released to us within 2 to 3 weeks. So I think the advantage of working with frozen eggs is that this is the fastest way to really get your journey started. However, I think it's also important to remember that egg banks usually only release about 6 to 8 frozen eggs. This is sort of a standard protocol. And from 6 to 8 frozen eggs, generally speaking, we only generate about 1 to 2 embryos, and the expected success rate is about 50%. And the likelihood of ending up with extra embryos to freeze as backup is relatively lower. Okay, so I think it's a reasonable option for parents who really only want to have one child. They're not planning on having any siblings. Maybe this is an option to consider. Of course, we have patients where they do plan on having a bigger family. They also want to plan for contingencies. What if the first transfer doesn't work out? As Laura mentioned, sometimes it may require a second or a third. And if we only have 1 embryo from those 6 frozen eggs, we have to go back and start generating embryos all over again. With a fresh egg donor, we typically expect to generate somewhere between maybe 10 to 15 embryos. And with chromosome testing, usually we end up with about 6 to 7 chromosomally normal embryos. So, the sort of ability to have more backup options with a traditional cycle is a lot more with a fresh IVF cycle. Okay, and so of course, also for some couples where both intended fathers want to generate embryos using their own genetic material, I think working with 6 frozen eggs really will be quite limited in a situation like that. I think it would be best to work with a fresh, egg donation cycle. With that, I will turn this back to Helen. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. That was really helpful.
Thank you.
And any questions, obviously, for Jeff, then we'll certainly circulate Jeff's contact details afterwards. But by all means, do ask any questions in the chat box and we'll pick them up. So next on the list is my very long-standing friend, not too long, but makes her sound older than she is, Natalie. And it's always very hard for me to introduce Natalie because I feel that, you know, there isn't really very much about surrogacy and the legal sphere that Natalie doesn't know. You know, having two children of her own, and, you know, being founder of NGA Law and really spearheading so many of the legal changes around surrogacy. You know, Natalie has always been at the forefront of the legal landscape as far as surrogacy is concerned. And of course, you know, working alongside me with Brilliant Beginnings, you know, helping us understand, you know, how far we can push the boundaries. You know, it's really been just such a wonderful journey over the last, you know, 15, 20 years to see how the changes have now come into fruition. But Natalie's going to talk to us today about, you know, where we are today in terms of COVID and helping people who are thinking about going to the US and considering the US as well as the legal, the UK landscape. So Natalie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we won't talk about how long we've been friends because it will out us for how old we are. But yes, sorry, say that again.
I said me more than you.
But I'm going to talk to you this evening about the legal side of things and how it all works. And as we've heard from Laura, there are lots of reasons why parents from the UK choose to go to the US for surrogacy. But we know that one of the very big reasons is to access the legal certainty that you can get if you conceive with a surrogate in the US. And that's a certainty that you don't have if you're going through surrogacy here in the UK, where surrogacy agreements are not recognised and the surrogate is initially named on the birth certificate. So I'm going to talk to you about how the legals work and kind of what that legal certainty looks like in practical terms, in terms of what happens and what you need to do. And it's worth starting by saying that we, within the NGA Law team, we help with the legal aspects of US surrogacy for many, many families, and we've done it over a very long period of time. And we do it in two different ways. So the first way is for parents who are navigating surrogacy in the US kind of under their own steam and kind of making their own decisions about how to manage the practicalities, where we kind of dip in to help with the legal side of things. And it's very much a kind of pick and mix service in terms of, you know, we can help you with advice at the beginning, we can help you with wills, we can help you with passports, we can help you with the parental order. But the other way of dealing with surrogacy and working with NGA is to be using the integrated pathway that we kind of co-manage with Brilliant Beginnings. And as Laura's talked about, the Brilliant Beginnings team can help you as intended parents to navigate all the practical side of things, you know, the choices you're making and the professionals that you're working with. And while your Brilliant Beginnings client manager is helping you with that, you will also have a legal manager from the NGA Law team who will be there to coordinate the legal side of things at every step throughout your journey. So you're not having to kind of work out what you need to do on the legal side and kind of when it needs to come in. It's much more kind of seamless, and we're managing all of that for you. So we will kind of coordinate with your US attorney and make sure that both the US legal side and the UK legal side are really integrated together. So first of all, the kind of how it works from the US end, it's much more kind of upfront and front loaded than it is in the UK. So the US attorney that you pick as part of that professional team that you're putting together is a really key member of that team. And what he or she will do is to make sure that the surrogacy arrangement that you're entering into is legally recognised. So you will have preconception written agreements that you put in place with your surrogate, and if you're using an egg donor, usually with your egg donor as well. And your attorney will represent you and help you put those documents in place, and your either surrogate or egg donor will have their own attorney as well. And that is the basis of your legal parenthood for US law purposes. It's all about, in the States, about intention and an agreement and the way things are set up from the beginning. So once you move through the process and you achieve your pregnancy, there will then be a legal process of some kind to go through in order to ratify that agreement and make sure that it's all kind of valid and ticked off so that when the baby's born, you can be registered on the birth certificate. The specifics of what that process looks like will depend on the state where your surrogate lives and will give birth. But again, your US attorney will guide you. And it's really important to choose a US attorney that is able to coordinate that for you across the states, because you don't know right at the beginning where your surrogate might live. And so we work with attorneys who are very experienced in dealing with international parents and have that kind of cross-state reach, if you like. So from the US end, it's very upfront, as I said, and you go into your surrogacy arrangement knowing that you are secure from a legal perspective, you are your child's legal parents, no one else ever is, and that you will be registered on the birth certificate in the US as soon as your child is born. The second stage in the process is then dealing with the UK side, because UK law lags behind. So notwithstanding all the process that you have followed in the US, for UK law purposes, your surrogate will be treated as the legal mother of your child, and if she's married, then her spouse will be treated as the father or the other parent. And that can also block your child from inheriting British nationality from you if neither of you is recognised as a legal parent. So from a UK perspective, there are additional steps that you have to take after the birth. Part of that is around navigating the practicalities of bringing your baby home. And then part of it is a court process that you need to follow in the UK for a parental order, which will make you the legal parents here in the UK and ultimately lead to the registration of your child's birth here in the UK as well. So you will get a UK birth certificate that matches up with the US birth certificate. Now, all of that process is very doable. So firstly, if we look at the coming home part of it, generally speaking, as Laura mentioned, the quickest and simplest way of doing that is to get a US passport for your child and then to travel home. And typically parents would come home within a few weeks of the birth. And we will help you kind of ease that process. We often provide a letter for parents to bring home that they can show at the border to kind of explain the context of their child entering the UK. Now, certainly the kind of travel issues are something that we've seen additional challenges brought by COVID within the last couple of years that we weren't expecting, but we've had to find solutions to. So first of all, we've obviously had the travel ban in place, which for quite a long period of time prevented UK citizens travelling from the UK to the US. Now, we had kind of various families who were expecting babies already when these travel restrictions were put in place. And, you know, we wanted to obviously make sure that they were able to get there for the birth of their children. So the attorneys that we worked with in the US were very much at the forefront of kind of, you know, finding the solutions for this and established a path whereby parents have been given access to the US under what's called the national interest exemption. So being given special permission to travel even if there are wider restrictions. And that, you know, towards the end of the restrictions being in place became a very routine thing to do. Those travel restrictions have been lifted, so that's nothing that we need to worry about at this stage. But just to kind of reassure you that even at the height of the restrictions, there was a way through to make sure that the parents we were working with could get there for the birth of their babies. And then in getting home, the kind of second challenge that we faced was difficulties with the US passport, with long delays where in-person offices were closed, you know, almost overnight back in April of 2020. So for a period of time, it was much more difficult to get a US passport. Now, those difficulties, again, they have gone away. So we're back to parents applying for a US passport and getting it quite quickly after the birth. But even when that US passport option was withdrawn, we did have a backup. So what we did is some very kind of swift lobbying. I was spending my days writing letters to Priti Patel to get to provide help to parents that were having babies born through surrogacy overseas. And the UK government agreed to put in place a special emergency passport process to help rescue those babies essentially that were born overseas. So that there was a solution to kind of get people home. And, you know, we are kind of got our finger on the pulse with working out, you know, what's the quickest way to get you home. So as things are changing, you know, throughout the pandemic, we've been kind of advising people on the most practical way of dealing with things. So I hope that reassures you that, you know, we hope that some of these travel issues are behind us now, notwithstanding kind of the news and Omicron and things kind of getting a little bit more difficult again. But, you know, even if in a worst case scenario, some of those restrictions return, it's not going to stop parents being able to get to where they need to be and to be able to bring their babies home. So the second part of the legal process then, which usually follows once you're home, is going through the legal process here in the UK to become your child's legal parents formally under UK law. And that's something you do by making an application to the family court here for a parental order. So it's a very well-trodden path. We, in fact, acted for the very first intended parents to have an international surrogacy arrangement ratified back in 2008. So it's, you know, a path that's been around for quite a long time. And even now we deal with more parental order applications than any other UK lawyers. So if you have gone overseas for surrogacy, your application will be heard by a High Court judge. It is quite an involved process, but there is no real risk of you getting to the end of it and not getting your parental order. It's much more about kind of navigating that process and making it as smooth and comfortable as possible. So the first thing to say is that you need to be very well prepared, and you need to give very full information to the judge so that they can be satisfied that you meet all of the criteria. So I'm not going to go through every one of the criteria, but just to pick out the few that are the ones that you know, often need a bit more focus and attention. First of all, you have to show that your surrogate, and if she's married, her spouse, consent to the parental order being granted. And that consent is only valid if it's given more than 6 weeks post-birth. So with a US surrogacy, although the legals may be all kind of dealt with up front at the US end, there will be some kind of tailing on stuff that your surrogate needs to engage in after the birth. And obviously we'll make sure that, you know, everybody's aware of that, and there's not going to be an issue around documents being signed and so on. Secondly, in terms of the payments that you make, the court will have to authorise retrospectively any compensation that you've paid to your surrogate if that exceeds reasonable expenses, which in a US surrogacy is typically the case. And in order to do that, the court will want to be reassured that there's no suggestion of exploitation and that you have acted in good faith. So it's very much about telling your story and showing that you've worked with reputable professionals, that you've got a good relationship with your surrogate, that you've done everything in a legal and sensible way. And again, you know, the way that you conduct yourself through the process and the people that you choose to work with are very key to that, but we can help you kind of craft that evidence. The third criteria to just touch on is the issue of domicile. This is very straightforward if you are British and have always lived in the UK and were born here. If you were born somewhere else and you're now living in the UK, or if you're British and living overseas, it may be more complicated. So both those scenarios are cases when you may well still be eligible for a parental order, but you'll need to provide careful evidence to the court. And again, we can help you with that. And then the last of the criteria to touch on is the biological connection. So to be eligible for the parental order, one or both of you has to have provided your eggs or sperm to conceive your child. Now, that's not to say that if you don't have a biological connection, there are no solutions available. And we've recently been involved in a case for a single non-biological mother where we followed a different path using adoption law to find a solution for her. So there are other ways of kind of dealing with things if you don't quite fit, but you know, obviously it's important to provide the information if you're following this parental order path. So secondly, the issue is then how you navigate the process. So it will involve some initial kind of court forms. It will involve you providing evidence and statements and a full bundle of information for the judge. There will be a light touch welfare assessment from a social worker who'll come and see you at home and then write a report. And there will be one or more court hearings before a High Court judge. So it is quite an involved process, and we, with the Brilliant Beginnings pathway, offer two different kind of options for how you manage that. With our premium service, we will manage that whole process for you, you know, getting it pushed through as quickly and proactively as possible and really taking the burden off your shoulders, as well as dealing with the birth certificate and then afterwards your child's UK passport application. If you're doing things in that way, it will typically take about 4 to 6 months to get to a final court hearing. We also have our basic pathway where we will steer you through the process, but slightly more slowly, and with you doing some of the work and kind of working in partnership with you so that you can save some cost, but make sure that you still have that kind of smooth process. And if you're doing things that way, typically it will take about 9 to 12 months to get to the final hearing. But we will support you with everything that you need to have in place to make sure that you can do what you need to do to act as parents when you get back and while you're in that limbo waiting for things to be resolved. So in terms of the effects of COVID on the court process, there have been some delays in some places, particularly around birth certificates and getting those issued once the parental order is granted. But there have been some positive things too. So the court has been dealing with court hearings via Microsoft Teams. So they haven't stopped kind of processing these applications even when it hasn't been possible to go to face-to-face hearings in court, which is really positive. We have seen there's about 3 or 4 judges in the High Court who typically deal with the surrogacy cases, and they all have a slightly different approach. And I think that's kind of diverged even more during COVID, with some of them trying to be really efficient and some of them less so. So I think, you know, having that knowledge of your particular judge and what they're going to expect and, you know, what they're likely to do in terms of managing your case is really important, so we can kind of guide you on those specifics once you get that far. So that's a kind of a real whistle-stop tour of kind of the legal process that we go through. I guess I just wanted to conclude by saying that you know, surrogacy in the US has continued throughout the pandemic. And we have had to, in some ways, kind of roll very quickly with finding solutions to new problems we weren't anticipating. But it's something that we really love doing. I think we get so invested in the families that we're helping, and we want to find solutions to the problems that arise. We want to get you home as quickly as possible. And so, although it's been a very challenging 18 months, it's also been a really energetic one, and we've really enjoyed the work that we've done. And it's lovely to see families still being created throughout all of these challenges. So if you're thinking of doing it this way, we will certainly kind of make sure we look after you, and we will have your back throughout the process. So thank you very much, and yeah, please do, if you've got any questions, I'm happy to pick them up at the end.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, and I think it goes without saying that the whole team is really, exactly as Natalie said, been really energized with being able to kind of work through some really tricky situations, but hopefully there is now a very solid path. So let's move on to Julie. Last but not least, Julie is a 4-time surrogate, and I'm not going to say too much apart from that. Not only is she a 4-time surrogate, she has her own 4 children, as well as a husband, lives in Connecticut, and is also heavily involved in surrogacy as a surrogacy coordinator for an agency. So, truly a wealth of information, and, we're terribly grateful that you've given up part of your day, Julie, to be with us today. And we'd love to hear more about surrogacy in the US from your perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you for such a kind, warm welcome. Yep, I am a 4-time carrier. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my experience as a surrogate and hopefully answer any questions that you have. I'm just going to touch on a couple of my journeys and some of the common questions that people do ask. I think the biggest question that I'm asked as a surrogate is, what brought you to surrogacy? The truth is, I knew I wanted to be a surrogate from the moment my first child was born. I dreamt of being a mother my entire life, and when that dream came true, it was the happiest I had ever been. I couldn't imagine a life without my children or the opportunity to have them. So I do have a sister and cousins who struggled with fertility issues, many painful losses, and I went on to have 4 babies, very easy pregnancies. My heart just broke for them. So as soon as our family was complete, I did offer to carry for one of my cousins, who shortly after very miraculously became pregnant on her own after many years of IVF. So my heart was still pulling me to pursue surrogacy, and I inquired with a small local matching agency. They asked if I would be willing to work with a hopeful mom who had just 1 embryo, could not afford a standard compensation. So I agreed to talk to her over the phone. We were both super excited, very nervous, but I knew right away that I wanted to help her. She had tried many other avenues to motherhood and experienced so much disappointment already. Unfortunately, our one chance at her only embryo did not work. So it was very sad, and she did take some time before making the decision to adopt an embryo through a program at our clinic. And that baby did stick on the first try, and our journey began. My children were 9, 6, 4, and 3 at the time. The experience was absolutely positive for them. They understood that we were helping this mama connect to her baby. They were all very, very proud to tell others what we were doing. A funny little story that I'll share, we had bought our kids a book called The Kangaroo Pouch, and it's a beautiful little book that explains surrogacy to children by using these kangaroo families, and just explaining that the baby was being kept warm in the surrogate kangaroo pouch until he grew big enough to be with his parents. My kids loved the book. In fact, I read it a few times in the beginning of our journey, and I came back for my very first ultrasound, and I asked the kids, do you want to see a picture of the baby? And my little guy, he was about 4, he came running over and said, I want to see a picture of the kangaroo. So it was really funny. He was kind of confused what was in there, but he eventually understood. Um, anyway, for this first journey, Mom lived about 2 hours north of us. She attended all my doctor's appointments through FaceTime. We called and caught up at least once or twice a week. Our relationship was mostly good. We did have a few bumps in the road. We had used a matching only agency, so they didn't provide any additional support through the pregnancy. So we were left to navigate some difficult or uncomfortable situations on our own. We found our way though, and we were really great friends. I delivered a baby girl, completing that first journey in September of 2014. The moment a baby is born through surrogacy is absolutely magical. When the doctor delivered that baby and handed her to her mother, there was not a dry eye in the room. It was a very special moment. Mom just cried and cried, holding her baby and thanking me 100 times. It was just so special, one of the best moments of my life, and actually for my husband as well. So it was such a wonderful experience that I did decide to pursue a second journey later that year. This time I did go through an agency, which was a seamless process. They provided support throughout the entire pregnancy. It was a lot more relaxed, very easy for all of us. I was connected to a gay couple. I loved their profile right away. One of the things on their profile, I remember they had in huge letters, "We want twins." And they had planned to put in two embryos, one from each dad using the same egg donor. The journey was different from my first because they were just bursting with optimism and positivity, while my previous journey was the result of a lot of loss and disappointment. So that one, there was some fear and cautiousness versus this one that was just like pure excitement. I think for the other mom, I think she had just kind of been holding her breath the whole journey, which is totally understandable. Anyway, the dads did get their wish, and I became pregnant with twins on the first try. They were only one state away, but we all had jobs and kids. And so again, it was just a lot of texting. We did call each other. They attended the appointments through FaceTime. They did come to the big ultrasound, the 20-week anatomy scan, and we found out they were having a boy and a girl, which was very exciting. I would send them belly pictures and videos of the babies moving in my belly. I even had a home Doppler, and I would just send them little recordings of the baby's heartbeats, which was also really cool. They loved that. So it was such a bonding experience for all of us, even without having a lot of in-person time. The babies were born at almost 38 weeks, absolutely perfect. Their dads would text me pictures and updates pretty much every week for the first year of their life, which I know is probably a little unusual, but it was so special. We were invited to their birthday parties. We try to visit once a year. It's been a little challenging with COVID, but following those two pregnancies, I did go on to carry for two more couples, which resulted in two little girls. My very last journey was right in the middle of COVID. So while that couple was also local to me, and we were anticipating lunches together and attending all the appointments together, unfortunately that couldn't happen. So it was again a lot of FaceTiming and texting and phone calls, and we were very, very close. In fact, Mom and I are now best friends. I text her almost every day. We're very, very close. And that baby was born this past July. So going into surrogacy, there were a few things that I did worry about. It was a brand new experience for me. I never knew anybody who was a surrogate. And I was very confident in my intentions, but a piece of me did worry about feelings that were out of my control. Would I feel an attachment to this child? Would it be painful to leave the hospital? And what does life look like after surrogacy? Like, how do these people fit into your life, and how do you define that relationship? I can honestly say that I have never felt a motherly attachment to any of the babies I've carried, from the day I leave the clinic after transfer until they are in their parents' arms. The only thing I'm focused on is keeping that little life safe. And when they're finally reunited with their parents, it is the most sacred, special experience in the world. Today, my first surro baby is 7 years old. The twins are 5, and the girls are 2.5 and 4 months. We have no pressure or expectations on what our relationships with each other should be. We send Christmas cards, birthday gifts. We text each other on random dates, like the anniversary of our transfer, or obviously the kids' birthdays. It's just very natural and very special. To this day, my kids talk about my surrogacy journeys with pride. They write little stories about it at school. They tell their friends, they tell their teachers. It's just a very special part of our lives. They love seeing updates and photos, and I have no doubt we will stay in touch with every family that we cared for in some way. No matter how much time goes by, we are just bonded by this really special experience. I'm obviously done having babies at this point, but I am directing my passion for surrogacy in my work. I am now a surrogacy case manager for a U.S. agency, and it is just truly an honor to continue to be a part of the special moments with surrogacy and helping make dreams come true for so many hopeful parents.
That's amazing, Julie. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I don't know what to say about it. It's just quite extraordinary, and you know how you just continue in this way is just quite inspiring. It really is. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hopefully for everyone listening today, it's real insight into really the extraordinariness of the women that come forward to be surrogates, that it really just feels more than just a commitment for a moment. It's a commitment for a lifetime, and your family, everybody is in it. So we're terribly grateful. Thank you. Okay, so we have got a couple of questions that have come through, and from Glenn, which I'd like to address first. And if there are any other questions, then please do add them into the chat box. And the first question is around insurance. And for those of you who, really haven't kind of stepped a toe into the US, and medical insurance and newborn insurance is such a complicated enigma, really. I think that's a very nice way of saying it. It's an enigma. We all know that medical costs in the US are generally, for around surrogacy, are privately funded. So insurance is such an important part of budgeting. And the question that Glenn around insurance has had is it possible to get insurance to cover all medical costs? Which insurers would we recommend or suggest? What kind of policies? We've all heard horror stories where intended parents are looking at some pretty hefty bills, and particularly in the days, I guess, when there were twin pregnancies and twin deliveries, where things can get quite expensive. So I'm going to ask Laura in the first instance to respond, and Julie, if there's any input that you have around insurance, we'd be really grateful to hear that as well. But let's look at Laura first. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Helen. So in terms of the landscape of insurance in the US, it changes incredibly regularly. So what we do is we would put you in touch with some insurance specialists in the US in order to look at your options at the point you were going to the US for surrogacy. You would normally get a insurance for your surrogate through the journey. So she may already have an insurance in place. You may need to top that up in some description in order to kind of cover the pregnancy. And generally that would cover the majority of the costs, but there may be some excesses within that. You would also need to find some newborn cover. And there are kind of options to insure against most eventualities. Lloyd's of London offer singleton insurance with varying levels of cover and excesses. And generally for cover of around about $250,000 would be kind of the mid-20s in $1,000 in terms of an actual policy. We'd also generally signpost to art risk for queries on insurances. And we can obviously share all these details after with anybody that does require them. I think one of the important factors at the moment to say is that unfortunately there isn't a newborn twin policy available in the US. So we would always encourage all of our intended parents just to safeguard for those ramping up of bills to opt for a single embryo transfer opposed to a double embryo transfer in terms of treatment.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Julie, I wonder whether is there anything else that you can kind of add to that?
She covered most of it. I just wanted to add quickly that I would say most of our surrogates do use their own policy. Obviously we have surrogates that we do purchase for, but there are a broad range of surrogates who are using their own policy that does cover surrogacy.
Yeah. I think the thing to, just kind of think about is that, when you're working with a particular agency, getting them on board in terms of what your budget is really important, because they will be able to identify a surrogate who will be able to work alongside your budget. And that, a big part of that will be what insurance have they already got in place, or what insurance can they access in order to help you achieve, whatever budget it is. And yeah, the options are surrogate with her own insurance, purchasing insurance, but then also obviously considering the newborn insurance, so that if you did have a baby that needed additional costs post-birth, that there is coverage around that as well. And Virginia Hart at ART Risk is super. She's a very well-renowned specialist, and she and her team will be able to advise. But first and foremost, it's about looking to the agency that you're working with, because they'll have that really good perspective. So hopefully that helps. And the second question is around surrogate fees. So if a surrogate had a compensation of £40,000, and sadly, if the baby was stillborn, or the surrogate mother miscarries, is there another fee for the same amount? Or I guess the question is does this cover the full term again for a live birth? Again, Laura, I'm going to ask you to respond to this, and Julie, anything else that you can add would be really helpful as well.
Yeah, no problem, Helen. So in terms of surrogate compensation, then up to the point where the surrogate would miscarry, then those compensation payments that had already been paid would not be refunded up to that point. So the compensation is staged throughout the pregnancy. And we're not aware of any type of insurance policy that would cover for the loss of that necessarily. So if you were then going into another pregnancy post a loss, then you would have the full kind of compensation to pay again from the beginning. Am I right in that, Julie? I'm pretty sure I am.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does set the reset button with a loss.
Okay, wonderful. Thank
And
you.
just to add on that as well, that all of that will be kind of set out in the contract that your attorney helps you put in place with your surrogate. So it should be laid out very clearly in terms of kind of how the payments are staged and what happens if there is a pregnancy loss at any stage of the pregnancy. So it's, you know, there shouldn't be any confusion about how that will work going into the arrangement.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, I had a question. You know, when they mentioned about insurance policies up to, you know, when you get it at Lloyd's of London, it will cover up to $250,000. In the absolute majority of cases, will that be sufficient to cover everything? I mean, I know these 1 million horror stories are probably not very often. They're probably rare, and it's probably absolute worst case scenario. But you know, is $250,000 normally enough to cover for everything if there was a problem?
Julie, do you want to answer that, or Laura?
Um,
To stab at it, but I think you're probably more on the cusp of it. So
Art Risk actually just had a seminar that did touch on that. And they do look at every person who has used the policy and if anybody has gone over that max. And the last slideshow that they did have, nobody had gone over that number. So that it is very comprehensive.
yeah, and I
Okay,
think
thank you.
I think the stories that we hear, or that we used to hear about, you know, the over £500,000 and $1 million is really where there's been, you know, a twin pregnancy or even triplet pregnancy, and babies are born very prematurely in NICU, and very, very complicated situations. So, you know, touch wood, all of that is very rare. You know, I think it's always sensible to kind of think at the top end, but you know, I think, you know, when you're considering a healthy surrogate, you know, good quality embryos, because you've got a team of people around you, then, you know, being able to budget within that 250 realm is fairly safe. Yeah, wonderful. That's really helpful, Julie. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
Has anyone got any other questions before we sign off for the evening? No. Wonderful. Well, you know, thank you ever so much to all of our speakers, you know, Laura, Dr. Jeff Wang, Natalie, of course, and Julie. We're ever so grateful for you giving up your time. And for all of you at home, just thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. As I said before, we're going to send around a copy of this, plus we'll send around all of the details of the various people that have spoken, but also for Virginia Hart, so that you can follow up anything with her directly. And I hope that you all stay safe and have a really lovely break when it comes. And Julie and Dr. Wang, thank you ever so much for giving up some of your afternoon in the gorgeous Connecticut. We're very jealous of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much.